Namaste and good evening. A very warm welcome to all the viewers for the 8th online interactive session, Samvada, brought to you by Virat Hindustan Sangham, Karnataka. In our 7th Samvada, we had Sri S.S. Sampath from Melkote, who spoke on Manusmriti, which is misinterpreted by most Hindu phobics. It was an excellent session, very informative, very knowledgeable, it had a lot of numbers and facts and figures and tearing into the phobics. And today, we have a very special episode with an author and an IT professional, Shri Ratnakar Sadasyula, who will speak on what led to the downfall of the mighty Vijaynagara Empire and the lessons for Hindus to learn from it. Let me briefly tell the viewers more of the speaker. He works as an IT professional for a living and is based out of Hyderabad. He's very passionate about history and started a blog, History Under My Feet, to share his knowledge on Indian history. Also, he has a podcast and YouTube channel under the same name and a Substack page too. He has been very active on Quora, sharing his knowledge on India, also awarded as top writer 4 times. He is the author of Victory, a book on rise and fall of the great Vijayanagara Empire. His other passions include reading, listening to music, and going on walks. His final punchline is just curious about life and the world around us. I'm joined today by our General Secretary National, Shri Jagdish Shetty ji. I'm also joined by Harish Patil, who will now host the program. Over to Harish Patil. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nikunji. Yes. Good evening, all. So I would like to now request Ratnakar ji to enlighten us with on the Vijayanagara Empire. Yeah, welcome to the show. Yes, Ratnakar ji, you can begin. Yeah, Ratnakar ji, you can begin with the session. Yes, thank you.
Namaste, everybody. This is Ratnakar Sadasyula here from Hyderabad, basically an IT professional with a passion for history. And today in my show, I'll be talking to you about the downfall of the Vijayanagara Empire. So I'll be sharing a presentation on this particular topic, and walking you through the presentation. So the focus, here is it. Downfall of the Vijayanagara Empire. Vijayanagara Empire, one of the mightiest empires in the world, one of the greatest empires of India, and one of the richest empires of its time. What happened to it that it fell so suddenly and swiftly after such a great rise? And what are the lessons we can learn from it? This is what I will be looking at in today's talk. Before I start with my talk, I'm just sharing some quotes to the audience Like this is one by Noah Feldman. He says empires inevitably fall, and when they do, history judges them for the legacies they leave behind. All empires fall eventually. By why? It's not for lack of power. In fact, it seems to be opposite. They become undisciplined. I think the second quote, if you take a look at it, that is relevant not only in the ancient or medieval times, it is relevant even today. I mean, no empire is permanent, no government is permanent, but when power gets into somebody's head and they become pretty, what do you call, overconfident and they become indisciplined, that downfall begins then and there itself. And if you take a look at and the third quote, great books of India and empire spoke to us. Most of the
Ratna,
yes, sir.
Ratnakarji, can you be little louder and also move that bar down regarding the stop sharing? That yeah, yeah, correct. Yeah, correct.
Are you able to hear me all?
Yeah, little louder would be great. Yeah,
Hello?
thank you.
Let me know if you're able to hear me. No? Hello?
Yeah, little closer would be great. Yeah,
Hello? Just let me know if you are all able to hear me.
yeah.
Okay. And if you take a look at the third quote, like an empire spoke to us, nothing small or unworthy. See, if India has been a country, land of many ancient empires, right from the Mauryas, Guptas, and the
Ratnakarji,
ancient. Yeah,
can you just click on the hide on the right side? Yeah, hide.
yeah,
Yeah,
sure. Thank you. So,
yeah.
India has been a land of many great empires, be it the Mauryas or Guptas in the ancient era, Vijaynagara in the medieval era, and later the Mughal. So but each of these empires, they have something to say to us. When we study the history of the empires, we can learn a lot from them, and which is what the third quote in this particular slide is actually meant for. So with not much ado, I'll be moving on to the next slide. So, a couple of things. One thing, this is actually not a very pleasant topic to look into. Like, generally when we read history, we only learn about the victories and conquests. And, when people generally don't are afraid of actually learning about the downfall or failures because it doesn't make for very pleasant reading. And sometimes it can be even more disturbing too. And I just want to emphasize that this what some of the points which I'm going to raise today are not going to be very pleasant. They're going to be disturbing and even might upset you. But again, like it is like only when we face the truth that we are able to learn the lessons from it. We cannot learn lessons by trying to hide from the truth. So if we take a look at this, any great empire like will have to end at some time or other. However, if you take a look at the Vijayanagar Empire, its ending was very swift and very sudden. Mind you, when this crucial battle of Talikota happened, Vijayanagar Empire was still the largest empire down south. I mean, yes, sometimes empires decline, like they all pretty much shrink to a very small size and just have some very weak successors. Nobody cares about that. But in case of Vijayanagar, when it was attacked at Talikota, it was still the largest empire in the south. Hampi was one of the most powerful and richest cities down here. So at its like just when the empire was at its peak, it suddenly fell. I mean, it was like a sudden blow that started the decline of the empire instead of a gradual rise, which actually makes it even much more tragic. So this session is what we'll be looking like. How did such a great empire like Vijayanagar meet with such a fate? Which is what I'll be looking at going ahead. Basically, if we all must have heard about Sri Krishna Deva Raya, the greatest emperor of the Vijayanagar Empire. And under him, all of us know that the Vijayanagar Empire reached its peak. His reign was called as the Golden Age of Vijayanagar Empire. And just as it reached its peak after him, after Sri Krishna Deva Raya passed away, the descent or the decline of the empire began. Though Talikota was the final blow, the descent had already started long before. And it started with his successor, Achyutraya, his younger brother. Achyutraya, unlike his brother, was a pretty weak, corrupt, and cowardly ruler, was not fit for ruling. And the actual power lay with Ramaraya, who was the son-in-law of Sri Krishna Raya, who actually controlled, was like the de facto power. And what happened was you had inevitably what happens, like when you have a weak ruler on the throne and somebody else controlling it behind it, a lot of palace politics were going on. People started fighting among themselves. And here what happened was, obviously when the people are infighting amongst themselves, the enemies take advantage. One of the first lessons which need to be learned: when we start fighting amongst ourselves, the enemies benefit. So obviously, taking advantage of the confusion and chaos, the enemy started attacking. Adil Shahis of the Bijapur kingdom, who were the main rivals of Vijaynagara, they recaptured the Raichur and Mudgal forts, which were won after a long, pretty hard effort. The Portuguese, on the other hand, on the west coast, they started attacking the temples. And this, and in the meantime, but here what happens is, instead of facing the opponent attacks, the nobles and the entire empire was divided into groups and camps who started infighting amongst each other. And they were not actually, and why in and taking advantage of this, all the enemy rivals of the empire, they started began to assert themselves. So I think this is one of the major lessons which you'll have to be looking at, is like what happens when you start infighting among yourselves. Who is the one who is benefiting? It's pretty obvious, right? And in the meantime, what happened was, Ramaraya, taking advantage, overthrew in a palace coup. He overthrew Achyutaraya. And here, what he did was, he called the Bijapur Sultan Ibrahim Adil Shah to mediate between these two. Infighting was a big mistake. I mean, you are fighting among yourself. That is a pretty big mistake. You are calling an outsider, and that too an enemy kingdom. That is the Adil Shah, who are or one of the sworn enemies of the Vijayanagara kingdom, to mediate, which is a blunder. So this is like, if you take a look at it, the two reasons are pretty apparent here. The first reason is the infighting that began. I mean, when Sri Krishnadevara was the ruler, he controlled all the infighting among the court and he maintained a strong grip. The minute he passed away, they started to quarrel among themselves. They invited enemies to mediate among themselves, and the empire's decline started then and there itself. And after that, you had a series of coups, like Venkatadri Raya, who succeeded Achyutaraya, was killed by his own uncle Tirumala, Salakaraju Tirumala, and who was again overthrown by Aliya Ramaraya, who placed Sadasyula on throne. So it was like it was like typical palace politics, one person overthrowing another. There was no stability at all here. Infighting was going on, and obviously it would be working to the advantage of the enemies. So I think the lesson is itself is apparent. You can see that though Talikota was the final chapter, the decline started much before. So so what happened next? Aliya Ramaraya, who was the son-in-law of Sri Krishnadevara, he assumed power. Now, Aliya Ramaraya was a pretty strong, pretty good warrior. He was known for his administrative ability, skills. He had everything. But he had a major problem, was his arrogance and egoism. His arrogant, haughty behavior and his playing of the politics in the court, like playing of one group against another group. I mean, he had this tendency to play this kind of politics, pit one group against another group, make them fight, and then so that he could gain power, is what alienated him from many nobles. I think people have this tendency, some kind of tendency, like, yeah, I'm playing Chanakyan politics, I'll put this group against another group. Ultimately, what is going to happen? Both those groups will turn against you. And this is what was happening in the Vijayanagara Empire also. So what Aliya Ramaraya did, he started this very disastrous tactic of playing of one Bahmani Sultan against another. I'll give you a context here. The Bahmani Empire was actually split up into 5 kingdoms. Like, you had Ahmednagar, the Nizam Shahis; Bijapur, the Adil Shahis; Golconda, the Qutub Shahis; Bidar was called the Imad Shahis, and you had Berar. Sorry, Bidar was Barid Shahis and Berar the Imad Shahis. Of these, Bidar and Berar were pretty minor kingdoms, but the 3 major kingdoms were Ahmednagar, Golconda, and Bijapur. So Aliya Ramaraya and these 5 kingdoms used to keep quarreling among themselves all the time. They had their own conflicts among themselves, and plus they had their own internal conflicts, like, typical brother against brother, son against father. So Aliya Ramaraya started interfering. He started intervening in these what was essentially the internal conflicts. when your enemies are fighting against each other, the most sensible thing would be to just watch and wait and watch and let them fight amongst each other and finish them off. But here he went inside and he started putting, he started taking sides for one against another, which did not really benefit. For instance, he allied with Ahmednagar and Golconda against Adil Shahis of Bijapur. But what happened? The Bijapur Sultan made peace with Ahmednagar when Golconda was defeated. In the meantime, when all this kind of tug of war was going on, when these Bahmani sultans and Vijaynagara were fighting or interfighting with each other, it was a pretty chaotic, anarchic situation. The Portuguese took advantage of this chaos and they attacked the port of Batkal, which is located on the east coast, and all the Hindus there were massacred en masse. So you can see what was happening. I mean, you can see where the second, you can see what was the second big mistake made in fighting. I mean, interfering in somebody else in fighting, which is not going to benefit us. But Ramaraya, in spite of this, Ramaraya refused to learn lessons from it. He again allied with Ahmednagar and instigated the Nizam Shahi Sultan to attack Bijapur. Bijapur internally was having a struggle between the Sultan Ibrahim Adil Shah and his brother Abdullah. His brother took the help of the Portuguese, who again attacked the capital. So, you can just see what was happening was under Krishnadeva Raya, the south was having a period of peace, stability, and prosperity. So all that stability was gone, and it had become a sort of anarchy where one kingdom was fighting against each other, and there were internal power struggles against each other, and where Ali Ramaraya should have taken advantage of trying to assert his control. He started playing along with this power politics, which would prove to be a very, very unwise move. And like, okay, well, let me give you one example. Like Ibrahim Qutb Shah, who was a sultan, who was ruling over Golconda, he had a tussle with his brother Jamshed, and he took and when I mean he and what he did was, during this conflict with his brother Jamshed, he fled from Golconda and he took refuge in Vijaynagara Empire in Hampi. And it was Ramaraya who gave him the shelter. And Ramaraya, what he did was, it was basically an internal struggle between two brothers, between Ibrahim Qutb Shah and his brother, which, we had no business to interfere in. But Ramaraya helped Ibrahim Qutb Shah to subdue the revolt to subdue his brother's revolt. And he also helped him later in suppressing another revolt by one of his subordinates. And now the irony here, what happened was, at the Battle of Talikota, the very same Ibrahim Qutb Shah whom Ramaraya assisted, whom Ramaraya gave refuge to, whom he assisted in putting down the revolt by his younger brother as well as subordinates, the same Ibrahim Qutb Shah was the one who beheaded Ramaraya on the battlefield of Talikota. So you can see what was happening. It was like, in effect, you are like, "Saam ko doodh pilana bol rahe na, ye hua." I mean, you are like basically feeding the milk to the snake here. Trying to assume a bigger role, and what happened? Ultimately, it backfired on you only. And I think this is the third lesson. Like, when you're beating up the enemy, when you're fighting with your enemies, always keep them at a distance. Always keep them at distance. Don't let them come here. And here he was like actively helping the enemies, the Golconda Sultan. And what happened at the end of it? He himself, there was no gratitude. He himself was killed by the very same person whom he helped. The same thing Ramaraya, again, he did the same thing with Ibrahim Adil Shah. He helped him against his brother Abdullah Adil Shah, who had the support of Portuguese. And then again he played one more tactic, like he allied with Ahmednagar, and then he attacked with whom he attacked the Bijapur Sultan, and then he recaptured the forts of Mudgal and Raichur. So you can see essentially it was a sort of Game of Thrones being played out here, with putting up one sultan against another, which in a hindsight seemed a very great, smart, practical move, but which was going to blow up in a very big manner. So I think if you take a look, if you are taking a look at some of these points, you can essentially see what were the mistakes being committed out here. First thing was the internal infighting within the Vijaynagara court, which the enemy camps took advantage of. Second thing was interfering in the power struggles of the enemies, of the rival camps. I mean, which was basically their own headache, and we were trying to interfere and play off one side against another, and which is what I'm going to see how this actually backfired very badly. And then we come to that part, that is the part of Talikota, 1565. Yes. So here Ramaraya tendency to play off one Bahmani Sultan against another Bahmani Sultan turned all against them. So obviously it's going to be, so two groups are fighting. You support one group, then you support another group, then you pit both of them. You start playing the all kind of politics. Sooner or later, they will turn against you. This is the same thing that happened here. He started playing of one Bahmani Sultan against another Bahmani Sultan, and end of the day, all of them turned against him. But what happened was, even though all the Bahmani Sultans, I mean, at least the three major Bahmani Sultans, that is Bijapur, Golconda, and Ahmednagar, all of them had turned against him. They knew that on their own, they still could not defeat Vijayanagara Empire, because Vijayanagara was still the largest empire down south. It had a massive army. It was one of the wealthiest, and Ramaraya was still a formidable warrior. So they knew that alone they could not defeat him. It was too formidable. In spite of all this infighting, in spite of all this power politics, in spite of all the revolts by others, Vijayanagara Empire at that time was still the largest empire down south. It covered most of South India. It was still one of the most formidable empire, which a single Bahmani kingdom could not defeat by themselves. And this is where, if you take a look at it, you can see what happened. That is when Ali Adil Shah's advisors suggested a confederation of all the Bahmani sultans. So I think this is the lesson. This is the biggest takeaway here. Basically, what happens is, sooner or later, all the people or enemies who are against you are going to unite against you, or what we call, you can say, like, this was the first kind of a sort of Mahabhagatbandhan, if you put it into current political terminology. So they suggested a confederation of all Bahmani sultans. Mind you, these Bahmani sultans were bitter rivals, especially Ahmednagar and Bijapur. They're always in conflict with each other. But when the time came and when their purpose was clear, they decided to unite for each other. And of course, so you had unity on one side. You had all the Bahmani sultans uniting on one side, and you had the Vijayanagar, which was like a camp which was like having its own infighting issues. I mean, I think that the lesson is, one of the reason is pretty clear out here. So here what happened was, on this advice, Ali Adil Shah immediately had an alliance with the Qutub Shah of Golconda, who then mediated between Bijapur and arch rival Ahmednagar. Mind you, just keep this in mind. Till then, all these Bijapur, Golconda, and Ahmednagar were bitter rivals. They are always fighting with each other, amongst each other in bitter conflicts. But when the time came to take on Vijayanagar, their common enemy was Vijayanagara Empire. And when the time came to take on Vijayanagara Empire, they forgot, or they put aside all their differences and united. And this is something which, so you can see what the series of mistakes that are being done by Ali Ramaraya led to. And obviously, and you have all these Muslim rulers uniting for a common cause. And they also did marital alliances, like Hussain Shah's daughter Chand Bibi was given to Ali Adil Shah. And so what happened was, you had a formidable alliance was built up between the three major kingdoms of Bijapur, Ahmednagar, and Golconda. I mean, alone, none of these kingdoms could defeat Vijayanagar. But when they united together, it was one formidable force. It was like Pancho Ungli or Ek Haath. I mean, that was यही हो रहा था यहाँ पे. And you along with these three big major kingdoms, you had Bidar and Berar. So you had a five kingdom alliances uniting together against the Vijayanagar Empire, which was going to be formidable out here. So I think this is one of the main. The reason is apparent. This is one of the main reasons apparent. So no matter how much you try to embrace the Islamic rulers, they are bounded when it comes to their common causes. They will always unite when they are attacking you. I mean, this is something I think which is something that needs to be emphasized again and again. And that led to the Battle of Talikota. Talikota is a very small town. It's also called as Rakshasatangadi. It is located in Bijapur district. Now here, and this is the other mistake. This is the other big blunder. While Bahmani sultans were making all these alliances among themselves, and doing this both the matrimonial alliances and building the alliances among themselves, Vijayanagar Empire, rulers of Vijayanagar were very cordial in their approach. Ali Ramaraya took things lightly. He took, yeah, I mean, he was not even, I mean, whether they did got the intelligence or whether they got the intelligence, but they thought this is not nothing going to be do. He took the threat very lightly. He felt that nobody could defeat Vijayanagar Empire. It was too strong, too formidable. Nobody could defeat him. He took things for granted, and when he was relaxing, so there you can see what was the one of the reasons: overconfidence. The ruler Ali Ramaraya was overconfident that nothing would happen. He did not, even when when all the Bahmani sultans were allying with each other, building up as a common alliance, he still took things casually, and which would ultimately prove to be fatal. So these five Bahmani, so this comprising of these five kingdoms ultimately came to Talikota. It was on 1565. And here what happened was, like, he got the, I mean, here, like, in spite of the buildup of the large army that was coming to them, the Vijayanagara Empire was still, I mean,
Hello, Ratnakar ji, we cannot hear you. Hear you? I think there is some disconnection.
No, I'm back here. So can you tell me till where it got cut off so that we can continue from that side? Hello?
Yeah, Ratnakar ji, you can continue actually. You can share the screen again. Ratnakar ji, you can continue now.
Talikota in 1565. In case you missed it, I'm just reiterating some of the points out here. Like as I told you, Ali Ramaraya's power games had turned all the Bahmani sultans against him. And this is where, like, so they realized one thing, that they could not defeat him on their own. He was too formidable. I mean, Vijaynagara was still one of the largest empires. It was powerful, it was wealthy, and it could not be defeated on its own. And that is when Ali advisors advised him, Ali Adil Shah's advisors, they suggested a confederation of all the Bahmani sultans. And Adil Shah then what he did was they started building up an alliance between one kingdom to the other. And mind you, the Bahmanis were bitter rivals till then. There was no love lost between Bijapur and Golconda or Bijapur and Ahmednagar. But for the sake of a common cause, they began to come together. It was like a sort of what you call as a Mahagathbandhan in present day politics. And they also made it a sort of marital alliance with Hussein Shah's daughter Chand Bibi, was given in marriage to Ali Adil Shah. And soon a formidable alliance was built up between the three major kingdoms of Bijapur, Ahmednagar, and Golconda, along with Bidar and Berar. So the battle finally took place on 1565, January 23rd at Talikota, a pretty small town which is located in Bijapur district.
You want to share screen, Ratnakar ji?
Yeah, I think, 1 second. Yeah, just let me know you're able to see it. Yeah. Just you're able to see the screen? Yeah. So they finally came at Talikota, a small town which is located in Bijapur district. Mind you, even then, Vijayanagar Empire was still pretty casual in its approach. Ali Ramaraya took things for granted. He was like, what will these people do together? But when he came to know that the huge Bahmani forces, where all these five kingdoms had come together against him, he sent an army of close to around 1 lakh infantry and 20,000 cavalry under his brother Tirmalaraya. Okay, and here what was happening was, the Krishna River flows through Talikota. Now, only way to cross it was to ford the Krishna River at one point, where Tirmalaraya camped himself with his forces. However, the Bahmani Sultans, they cleverly played a trick to show that they are attacking from some other side, and they diverted the Vijayanagara army there and crossed the river at this particular point. So it was a pretty much a big failure of intelligence out here. And soon on 23rd January 1565, the Battle of Talikota began. Bahmani Sultans had 3 layers of artillery and around 2,000 foreign archers. They began to attack. The Vijayanagaram army initially faced strong reverses, like they were beaten back strongly. But Venkatadri Raya, the other brothers, started attacking, counter-attacking fiercely. Was sending, they're sending the artillery onto the Bahmani Sultans. And Ali Ramaraya himself led the charge into the flanks of the Bahmani Sultans. And for quite a long time, the battle kept going on and off. Like it kept switching between the two sides. Like at one stage, the Vijayanagar army was having the upper hand. At one stage, the Bahmanis were having the upper hand. A fierce battle was going on at Talikota. And now, this is where the battle turned. There were a couple of 2-3 contingents of Muslim officers in the Vijayanagar army. Basically, they were archers recruited as archers because, some of the earlier empires felt that they needed better archery skills to fight the battles. Here, what happened, there were two brothers, Jilani brothers, who were leading these contingents. At the very crucial moment, these Muslim officers in Vijayanagar army switched sides to the Bahmanis. So I think it is obvious what was the mistake being done. You were trusting somebody. You are trusting the Muslim officers, who ultimately, when it came to when the time came for reckoning, they switched sides to the other side. And you know what was the common thing? The religious factor. And that means the Vijayanagar army was essentially surrounded from all sides. They were like betrayed. Like you trusted people, and those people betrayed you. Obviously, it was going to turn back. It was going to turn back against you. And soon, with the Vijayanagar armies being surrounded from all sides by the Bahmani soldiers, this was bidding a room. Ramaraya himself fell down from his elephant and was captured, and it led to a very tragic end. He was given a choice of converting to Islam, but he refused and was beheaded. And like I told you, the person who beheaded him was Ibrahim Kuli Qutub Shah. Yes, the same Ibrahim Kuli Qutub Shah whom Ramaraya gave refuge to, whom he helped in suppressing the revolt against his brother, as well as his associate. What did he get for this? You can see it here. And this ended up in a complete rout for the Vijayanagar army. Around 5,000 soldiers were dead, including Ramaraya and Venkatadri Raya on the battlefield. After 3 days, the Bahmani forces entered Hampi. One of the world's richest cities was looted, destroyed, and razed. They broke the temples, they looted. Vijayanagar was Hampi was one of the world's richest cities. Then they looted the riches of Hampis. They carried away many slaves. They broke, and mind you, it was such a massive city, Hampi, that it took almost like 4 to 5 days to entirely destroy the city. And the fires were seen from distances. And if you take a look at it, the date on which Hampi had to suffer this devastation, 26th of January 1565. Yes, pretty ironical if you take a look at the date on which Hampi was devastated. So, and thus ended one of the greatest empires in the world, one of the greatest, richest empires in the world. It ended in such a tragedy. If you have followed my presentation, some of the lessons would have been apparent to you. One was the infighting against the Vijayanagar army. The empires which the enemies took advantage of. The other was interfering in the succession disputes, interfering in the internal conflicts of the Bahmani sultans and their succession disputes. The other and third mistake was being overconfident, like when the Bahmani sultans were building up alliances against themselves. The Vijayanagar army Ali Ramaraya did not take it seriously, though knowing there was a major threat to the empire out here. And finally, on the battlefield, though they fought valiantly, the biggest last fatal mistake was trusting the Muslim officers' contingent to switch sides at the last battle. Also, there were some other issues like with the strategy, like where the Bahmani sultans were using horses, the faster horses, the Vijayanagara army still relied on elephants, which are much more slower moving, and that was a major disadvantage. And that worked in the favor of the Bahmani sultans pretty much a lot. And and of course, like, and finally, like, when you're striking the enemy, either you crush the enemy fully or keep them at a distance, but trying to have peace with the enemy, or trying to play trying to do your own internal power politics with the enemy, or or not being obvious of what the strategies and all they're up to, that is obviously going to turn very, very fatally against you at some time or another. And that is how the great and mighty Vijayanagar empire fell. I mean, I wouldn't say it was the decline. I wouldn't say it was the end of Vijayanagar Empire exactly, but the decline started from there. Mind you, even after Talikota, Vijayanagar Empire was there for quite a long time, but it shrunk to a pretty pale shadow of its former self. The great empire that once upon a time ruled the entire southern part of India was just a shadow of its former self. All its feudatories broke away and they began to form their own kingdoms out here. And the empire slowly went into its own decline. So, and yeah, so that is pretty much what I wanted to be. So that is pretty much what I wanted to be sharing out here on why the Vijayanagar Empire declined in this particular time period. And yeah, so I think now we can go over to Harish for any questions or anything. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ratnakarji. Yes, that's all the one you and the wonderful information which you share with us with your analysis and history. It is a truth. The history is history, and the past is past, and we have to learn from it. Yes, and the thing is that here many of us know
Yeah,
what the
hello.
Vijayanagara Empire was, and the thing is like the beginning of the Vijayanagara Empire, how it formed and how it flourished. The city was flourished, and many of the foreign travelers had been written books about it, and they acknowledged it with a lot of
Mhm.
gold in sold on the streets and big cities, which was compared to present London at the present city. Those things and all we were heard and we were learned in the history of our textbooks. But the thing is that many of them don't really know about the history of Vijayanagar downfall, what it happened, and the reason behind it. So we thank you for sharing with us
Yes.
with the information. Yes, and yes, I have a few questions from my end. So post downfall of the Vijayanagara Empire, there were few other small kingdoms which were formed
Mm.
because it's a massive uh,
Yes.
empire, right? Before in southern India. So one of
Mm.
them was
Yeah.
the Mysore kingdom. Yes, Mysuru. So Wadayas we used to rule it. So
Mm.
despite this defeat, the tragic defeat of the Vijayanagara Empire, still the Mysore Wadayar were they had what do you say employed Hyder Ali as a commander in chief, and later
Yes,
on
they didn't
Hyder
learn
Ali,
from it.
Hyder Ali still able to capture the what do you say
Yes,
like
they still didn't learn lessons from it.
why they didn't learn it? I mean, what is any reason for that? Actually, Hyder Ali, they made them what is as a house arrest. So
I
and
think
you
so,
know that
yeah.
Tipu Sultan, how his son defeated. I mean,
Yeah,
he
see,
conquered
basically,
and
like, see, again, like, typical what happened was, see, it was like history repeating itself. Like I told you how Vijayanagar Empire, they started, Ali Rama, like how Ali Ramaraya started this practice of allying with one Bahmani Sultan against another. Like, basically, if you take a look at it, like after the decline of the Vijayanagar Empire, there were three major kingdoms that came up after the empire declined. So one was the Bodiyars, the other was the Keladi Nayakas of what do you call the Nayakas of Keladi. You might have, I think you should be knowing about Keladi, right? The Keladi Nayakas were one, and the other one was the Madurai Nayaks. Madurai Nayaks are actually a former, the person who founded Madurai Nayak kingdom was Vishwanath Nayaka, who was a former commander in Vijayanagara Empire. And once the Vijayanagara Empire started declining after Talikota, these kingdoms began to assert themselves. Now, again, the same mistake where these kingdoms together could have presented a united front. I mean, could have unitedly fought against the Bahmani. I mean, the same time, the other hand, also the Bahmani sultans again, after Talikota, they are united for Talikota. After Talikota, they again started fighting among themselves. So it was a pretty chaotic situation in the south then. Now, here again, what happened was like, there was a long-term rivalry between the Madurai Nayaks and the Wadayars, primarily for control of the south, primarily for control of the Kongru. And and again, like they started. So the Madurai Nayaks used to take the help of some of the Bahmani sultans, and in order to counter them, the Wadiyars they began to use Hyder. I mean, Hyder Ali was like just a small time commander. So they used. So he actually managed to help them win some battle against Madurai Nayaks, and sooner or later he turned against them and he overthrew the Wadiyars and he captured power out here. So again, like I told you, the same mistakes that happened in Vijayanagara Empire, they refused to learn from it. Like the same infighting, the same, trusting the Muslim warriors and rulers, same trying to playing internal politics. The same thing happened again.
Yeah, the same thing. Yeah, that happened. The partition of India and Pakistan
Yeah,
also.
those who don't learn from history, they say that those who don't learn from history, they content to repeat it. That's what is happening, and I think in a way that's what is happening nowadays also. But that's another topic altogether.
Is it like too much of trusting them despite their ideological differences? Is it happening backfiring us, the Hindus? Or
Absolutely. I think I shown the examples of like I shown the example of Ibrahim Qutub Shah. Though Ali
yeah,
Ramaraya helped him, he gave refuge to him, he helped him in his struggles. Ultimately, what happened? He was the one who
killed
created
him.
it. And then the Jilani brothers in Vijayanagaram company who were, who led the Muslim contingent there to switch over to the Bahmani side right at the crucial time of the battle. And it was, I mean, it happened again in like in the north. If you take also like there, it of course it was not Muslims, but they're the like fellow Hindus like Battle of Kanwai. It was Shiladitya who backstabbed Rana Sangha, or some of the other fellow Rajput rulers who allied with the Muslims against Akbar. So the one thing, but the main thing, like one is the lack of unity, and allying with the other Muslim rulers just to just for just because like you have your own internal
Power
issues with.
structure.
So basically, like, see the basic. It's a basic, simple funda. Whatever infighting we have among ourselves, you should not invite outsiders to take advantage of it. And if you take a look at the history of most of our Hindu kingdoms, that has been the case. Infighting among ourselves is bad, but we asked outsiders to interfere in that, and we never refused to learn from it. I mean, we refused to learn from that. So many, in spite of so many disasters.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for the information. Yes. Yeah, Tejas, you have any questions, or you can share it from the audience.
Yeah. So I had one question, Ratnakar ji. Like we saw that if we want to check what has, there are many things which we need to learn from the Vijayanagara Empire. So, like as you said, like Vijayanagara Empire was one of the richest empire like in the world, like from around mid 14th century to 17th
Hmm.
century. Yeah. So
Okay.
like it was, if you take it from like governance to industry to defense, so like it managed industrialization and it also managed to keep common people happy during that times. So like, and this has been recorded by like our some of like the comments from the Persian ambassador Abdul Razak and the Italian travelers also, like Nicola Conti. So how effectively they manage the industrialization, and what the current government or the current people in the power, or what we can learn from this perspective also. Can you enlighten us? Because they managed so well that they were one of the richest empire. They developed across all the like across industry, culture, defense, economic front, everywhere. So how they manage this industrialization so good, like on a good point
Yeah,
of view, from
yeah, I got
like
your question, Tejas.
learning from this point of view. Yeah.
See, one thing is like, Vijayanagar Empire rulers right from the beginning, much before Krishnadev Raya, you can say from the Sangama, so the first dynasty, they built up a very strong administrative structure, a very robust administrative structure. So, like, you had the entire empire. The empire was divided into different provinces. So each province had a governor in charge. Each province had a governor in charge, and the governor had other officers working on him. So it was a pretty very robust administrative structure they had in place. And again, like, and that was one thing. And then again, this each then again the the emperor who was in Hampi, he had his own cabinet with the emperors with ministers for designated purposes, and these ministers again played a major role in the administration of the empire. And they again, like, they ensured, and you're asking like how people benefited, because I'll tell you one thing. One thing about the history of the Vijayanagara Empire, though they had to keep fighting continuous battles, they had to fight the Bahmanis, they had to fight some other rivals also, like the Gajpatis. They're always fighting some battle or other. They ensured that the day-to-day administration was not affected because of this kind of because of this kind of administration structure. So, like, each province had its governor. The governors took care of the administration of the provinces, and and they had a pretty, and they actually cared for the welfare of the people. See, I'll tell you one thing, like, if you take a look at Hampi, it is built in a pretty rocky area. I mean, if any of you have been to Hampi and if you observe it, it is built in a pretty rocky area. And though the Tungabhadra river flows to it, see, in the south, unlike in the north, the rivers are not perennial rivers. Like, only during rainy season they become full. Otherwise, during summer or winter, they become pretty dry. And Hampi is a pretty rocky area, and where Tungabhadra is not particularly deep. And some of the areas that ruled over also were pretty dry, rocky areas. And what they did, in such a rocky area like Hampi, which didn't have any particular water source, I mean, you just had the Tungabhadra river, they built up a very advanced irrigation system, a very advanced network of canals that brought water all the way from the river to Hampi and ensured, I mean, man, it was a massive city, Hampi. It was one of the largest cities in the world at time, with a population of almost like maybe around 100,000. And they managed to supply water to all the citizens of Hampi during that time. So you can see that they played a lot of, that was like, you know, actually the way they built up the network of canals, that is a different topic about, and sort of canals and aqueducts to supply water to Hampi. That's a separate topic by itself. But that was one thing they did. And also, like, not just in Hampi, they dug a lot of tanks all over the region, all over the kingdom. Like I tell you, I'm from my state, Andhra Pradesh. We have this area called Rayalaseema, which is a pretty dry area, dry rocky area. I mean, its name is it's called as Rayalaseema because it is like named after the land of the Rayas, or Rayalavari Seema. Even now, if you can go here, you see many tanks which were dug by the Vijayanagar rulers then. Mind you, it's a pretty dry, rocky area with not much perennial rivers, but in such an area, they dug a lot of tanks for the benefit of citizens, for the benefit of the ordinary people, and that is how the people benefited. And that's how the people benefited from that rule. And the other thing was like, and the other thing also, they focused a lot on the internal trade. I mean, they had, like, they took advantage of the fact that they had ports like Baktal and Mangalore on the Goa on the west coast, and Machilipatnam on the Kaval on the east coast, and they had a flourishing trade with other countries also. Like, they had trade with China, they had trade with some of the Arab countries, and they had a flourishing trade also, which ensured. I mean, you must have heard about how what you call diamonds, rubies, pearls was sold in the streets of Hampi, and that was because of this kind of flourishing trade where which they had with other countries, where they exported spices to the other countries, and in their turn they got all these weaponries and horses and Wilson. So here we have to think. I mean, it's actually a separate topic. Maybe if I have some other session, but to summarize it, all I can say is that Vijayanagara Empire had a very robust administrative structure that ensured that the ordinary citizens were benefited from the rulers, apart from its military conquests and victories out here.
Correct. Correct. Thanks, Ratnakarji. And there was one question from Veer as well. Like, what happened to the sacks of diamonds which were famously traded on the Hampi streets,
Yeah,
and in
actually, there
which
are
country they are right now? Like, yeah.
yeah, actually, there's one version which states that Tirumala Raya, who was the brother of Ali Ramaraya, he fled. He fled Talikota after the defeat. So they say that he carried many of these treasures on elephants from Hampi to Penukonda, which effectively became the second capital of Vijayanagara Empire after the devastation of Hampi. And these treasures were carried on elephants from Hampi to Penukonda. There were there are instances of people digging in Penukonda Fort and near Chandagiri, hoping to, find that treasure and all that. But and I think some of them, of course, obviously, were looted by the Bamani sultans also. Like, yeah.
Okay. That's it. Thanks, Ratnakarji. And last question we had is like, please, if you have any authentic books, including yourself, on the
Mhm.
Vijayanagar Empire and its downfall, like the viewers want to know.
Actually, I think you can have a reference in my book, City of Victory. I think I shared. I can share I shared the link somewhere in the WhatsApp, but I can share it again. You can find it for City of Victory uh, by Ratnakar. You can search it. It's on Amazon. You can. It has both the print and Kindle version. And though it is not a scholarly work on Vijayanagara Empire, it's more a layman sort of work on Vijayanagara Empire, where I quoted the references which I did too. And yeah, there are some other like you have a Forgotten Empire by Robert Sibbel, which was the basis of my book on Vijayanagara Empire. But that's again a very academic work and pretty difficult language also. But if you want, you can give it a read also. And these are some of the books which I can recall. And yeah, but for starters, you can have a look at my book, City of Victory out here.
Thanks, Ratnakarji. Nikunji, Jagdishji, or Harish, yeah, you can, if you have any question.
Harish, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have one small question. Yeah, I just want to take one opportunity. So, Vijayanagara Empire, the power was like a dictatorship, or it was like completely a democratic kind of thing. The power was completely distributed. How was it?
Harish, can you come again? I didn't get your question.
So the question is like the administration of the Vijayanagara. It's related to the Tejas what he has asked. So was it like a distributed one, or it was like completely a dictatorship kind of thing?
Harish, what I understand you're asking, like, was it totally dictatorial or was it decentralized? If I'm not wrong.
Yes, 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 yes.
Correct.
See, okay, let me like see. While the emperor was the sole power, while the emperor was the main power. See, it was like a sort of mix of both. While the emperor was the main power, the governors of the independent provinces had their own autonomy. Like the governors of various provinces, they had their own autonomy to frame their rules, to frame their laws. Though the emperor's rule was the final one, though he was the main ruler, he gave equal freedom to the governors to rule the provinces about in their own way. And but they reported back to the emperor out here. So while it was centralized in a way, it was also ensured that all the provinces into which you are divided, they had their own autonomy. Apart from one more thing, apart from the governors and the provinces, you also had this feature of palegas. You had the who were basically chieftains of small estates or jagirdars. They were called as the the palegars or palekaras. So they are basically autonomous chieftains who presided over some small kingdoms, like sort of jamindars, who had their own private armies. So they again had the autonomy to rule that particular land in whatever way they had. And here what happened was these particular Palekar rulers, whenever any major battle broke out in the Vijayanagara kingdom, they sent their army to the war. Like you had the main Vijayanagar army. Vijayanagar had its own army, but you had all the other smaller kingdoms and chieftains who would also contribute to the army. That's how they managed to win so many battles and conquests out here. So while the emperor was the main figure, while it was centralized in that aspect, the provinces it was also decentralized in another way also. So you can say it was a sort of mix of both.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ratnakarji. Yes. Jagdishji, you have any questions, or you can end up the show?
So please proceed.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I would like to thank Ratnakarji for taking the time and enlightening us the informations of the Vijayanagara Empire and lessons to be
Thank
learned
you.
by the
Thanks,
gurus.
Harish and Nikunj.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I would like to thank our technical team led by Tejas, Iyer, and Gadgi Rakesh for making this successful. And I would like to thank even the Nikunj for the things. Yeah, thank you for your time. Yes, thank you, Dhanyavad.